For decades, we've built military systems for men and expected women to adapt. But what if it's the system and not the soldier that needs to change? Hello and welcome back to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. I'm Martin Jones.
And I'm John Paul Nevin. Today, we're joined by a world-leading expert on the health and performance of women in the military, the British Army's principal physiologist, Dr. Julie Greeves.
Training, nutrition, all these policies have been obviously based on the male phenotype and the requirements for men, but they are different for women. So if we train more properly for women's needs, I think we're going to see a population who are going to have huge value.
As more women enter ground close combat roles, there is an ever-increasing need to understand and address female health and performance challenges.
The physical and physiological differences really predispose women to injury because women train alongside men. Unlike athletes, they operate and train alongside men. So the physiological strain on women is about 40% higher than for men when they operate in an integrated manner.
We discuss the role of the menstrual cycle and explore the operational environments where female physiology can provide a performance advantage.
Women oxidise fat more readily during submaximal exercise than men. So the type of exercise that's characteristic of long patrols, women benefit under those conditions because they're able to preserve their muscle. Women preserve muscle, men start to break down their muscle on field exercise. So there's a metabolic benefit of women when they're operating in those environments.
Hi Julie, and welcome to the Optimizing Human Performance podcast. How are you today?
I'm really well, thank you.
Excellent. And where do we find you at the moment?
Well, I'm dialing in from home, but I'm based at Army headquarters on a more day-to-day basis.
Great stuff. And leading on from that, can you give us a background of your career? Obviously, you're at Army HQ at the moment, but how did you get there and what is it that you do with the Army?
Yeah, of course. So I'm the principal physiologist for the Army. I'm also a professor in applied human physiology. My background is in exercise science. I specialise in human performance, occupational physiology, but my research specialism is in female soldier health and performance and musculoskeletal health, specifically bone biology. And these were the topics of my PhD, which was quite a while ago. I started my postdoc career at the Defence Evaluation Research Agency, which then privatised into Kinetic. And there I led large-scale projects on musculoskeletal injuries of service personnel in the air and land domain. So ostensibly neck, back pain in air crew and stress fractures in soldiers. And then I moved over to the Army in the initial training organisation in 2008, where my work focused on basic military training. And then from 2015, I developed and led the Women in Ground Close Combat Research Programme, creating a permanent human performance research team at Army headquarters and establishing research labs at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, where most of our early work was performed. And then research-wise, I've published over 140 papers, mostly military. But the purpose of my role is to make this research count the organisation so that our evidence pulls through to practice and making that difference to service personnel, which I refer to as the bench to battle space pipeline. And right now our focus is exploiting the evidence from the Women in Ground Close Combat Research Programme. And then from a female performance perspective is to start focusing on what success looks like for women in GCC roles, because we haven't researched this population yet. And this will help us refine selection, training and support systems to enable women to thrive in the military.
So, Julie, could you give us more of an insight into the Women in Ground Close Combat project, which you mentioned, but also the establishment of the physical employment standards and role-related fitness test soldiers' batteries?
Sure. This research started in 2014 when the Secretary of State for Defence announced a review of the exclusion of women in GCC roles. And the intent was to maximise talent to defence and delivery of equality of opportunity. And the rationale for excluding women in previous reviews was based on the impact to team cohesion, which we believe no longer held any weight based on the experiences of recent operations at that time. But we had no evidence on the potential health risks or performance challenges with women operating in these more punchy roles. So this research was initiated to deliver this, what was a step change in our understanding of the physical challenges and potential risks to women in GCC roles. And I think it's important to understand that this lack of evidence is not unique to defence. Historically, women have been excluded from research, and we see that in mainstream medicine, sports medicine, exercise, physiology. And when our working population comprises just 10 to 12% of women, they are woefully underrepresented in the military. This compares with 51% in the general population. It's really hard to champion female-specific research. But we had the go-ahead to shape a research program. I focused on addressing problem statements based on my experience and knowledge in female physiology, working with a superb military occupational consultant. And 4 themes emerged from that kind of brainstorm, which was physical performance, but specifically training, physical training, load carriage, nutrition, postpartum, looking at very female-specific gaps. Musculoskeletal injuries, particularly to the skeleton, where we know women are more susceptible, reproductive health and mental health. But the early milestone was the development and implementation of the physical employment standards for GCC roles. And we needed gender-free, legally defensible tests to ensure that we were recruiting the right people who were physically able to perform the role. This was our safeguard. And in 2019, following the implementation of what we then termed the role fitness standards for soldiers, we opened the doors for new female entrants to join GCC roles. And then since then, I led this research to completion in 24, and we are now currently working to implement all 74 actionable recommendations.
That's awesome. So where are you now in terms of that action plan? Have all 74 been implemented, or is it a timed implementation over a number of years?
So we are really making good progress. I think for anybody who's involved in research, implementing findings from research is notoriously very difficult. So we work with our organisational learning team in the Army to use a framework where we take our conclusion almost from the research and then shape those into actionable recommendations for the stakeholders. And that's been a little bit of a learning curve for me, because what I would consider a recommendation isn't necessarily actionable. So we've been really learning about who the stakeholders are, how we engage, are we influencing policy? Do we need to educate? Or are we doing something a little bit more inventive? So we tend to then bucket how those recommendations then are going to be implemented. And we are making really good headway. 74 recommendations, that's a huge amount of research. We've got a very complex stakeholder network, but we're already changing policies in terms of nutrition and training. But there's more to go, because we've got some complex topics on fertility and menstrual health. It's just going to take a bit more time to really unpack that in terms of how we can make that positive change to the organisation.
Julie, could you give an example of how one of those recommendations has been applied real world? So i.e. it's been taken on board as policy and then implemented?
The best example for me, and I'm going to go back to this because it was a really difficult one to implement, will be the physical employment standards, because we never had them. We never had them in the trained strength. We had them at the front door for the Army. And these were fairly new, I think, even defence-wide, worldwide. It's really hard to implement standards because at challenging times of shortage in recruitment, and the organisation want to change the goalposts, but then when you start changing standards, you then become legally vulnerable. But we've been successful at identifying who the owner is of this policy, implementing the policy. And this is at a time when organisations are in constant flux and constant change in terms of owners of different policies. And we've implemented it, and we have successfully retained those standards. We will get to a time when we need to revise those standards. When there's changes to equipment or the operating environment, we need to make sure that we are current, and we'll be approaching that time with the GCC standards soon. But we had standards for GCC roles. It didn't mean that we could neglect the non-GCC. So what we did in 21 was also roll out the standards for all ground close combat roles, non-GCC roles. And that wasn't the original intent, but it was the duty of care to make sure that we had those legally defensible standards across the board. So that's probably been the most widespread, effective, and ones that we have managed to protect. And it was the first thing that we tried to do as well. So I think that's a really good success case for us. What we did at the time as well was we worked with our NATO counterparts to establish a NATO framework, and that's become the gold standard. And we set the standards of how to conduct this work and make sure that it's watertight from a legal perspective, scientifically valid, but it's there as a really important training tool, because now we know what the demands of these roles are and how our soldiers, our service personnel, should train against those standards. And I think what was really most stark is that before we had the AFT, which was the 8-miler, I think it was hour and 50 with 25 kilo, and that was accepted as the standard in the trained strength. But when we developed these tests, we have 6 tests, and 60-70% of those tests are upper body, and we've never had an upper body performance test in the military before. So it really kind of illustrates where our gaps were before these standards were introduced. And that's really important when it comes to women, because women have pronounced less muscle than men. And particularly for the upper body, it's probably about 60% lower for women than men in the upper body. And it just shows that we have to train the upper body. So by having these standards and tests, we know where the deficits in the training are and where we can close those kind of gaps and make sure that we are training properly for role.
So Julie, an observation that I've made, I don't know whether this is true or not, so you can correct me off the bat and then maybe we can look into it in a bit more detail. But it seems to me that women are just more likely to get injured doing some of these arduous courses, arduous training. First and foremost, is that true? Are injury rates higher for women? And then secondly, I guess, is there anything to it? Is there any reasons for that?
Well, I think we need to go back to what those differences are between men and women, particularly the physical differences between men and women. And we know, and we've got lots of data on this now, women are shorter than men. They have more body fat. So you could consider that to be more kind of dead weight, but it's really metabolically important tissue. They have less muscle, about 40-50% less muscle. And even the architecture of that muscle is different. So women have more slow twitch fibers, but less of the type 2 fast twitch fibers, which are really important for power and strength. And they have a smaller skeleton. And these are really important attributes in terms of why women are more susceptible to injury. They also have smaller heart and lungs and lower hemoglobin. So the physical and physiological differences really predispose women to injury because women train alongside men. Unlike athletes, they operate and train alongside men. So the physiological strain on women is about 40% higher than for men when they operate in an integrated kind of manner. And that has implications in terms of, obviously, the risk of injury, but also the loads they carry are absolute. So when you have a smaller frame, a smaller skeleton, carrying a relatively much heavier load, then that obviously means that the tissues are under much greater stress. And I defer to bone examples because I'm a bit of a bonehead. And if we look at the shin bone and we think about the mechanics here, and I'm not an engineer, but if we think about a thin and a thicker stick and you apply axial compression to the stick, it's the thinner stick which will break first. And that is a model of what the female tibia is like. It's under greater stress and therefore it's going to be more susceptible to a bone stress injury. And we do see that. So in phase 1 training in particular, we have recruits come into training. They're very unfamiliar with the training environment, new kit, much heavier training loads than they probably experienced before. And more women than men do fracture at about probably 2 to 3-fold greater rate, and more so at the hips as well. The biomechanics, the anatomy of the hips are different for women. So again, women are more susceptible to hip fractures. But I think what's really, really important is that when we were looking at the epidemiology of injuries at the start of this program, we looked at whether infantry men recruits were at a greater risk than regular recruits because they're fitter. They were coming in much fitter. So in theory, they should be at a reduced risk of injury, and they were. But their risk of stress fractures was 7-fold higher than it was for regular recruits. So once you start upping the pace and the impact and the loads, even if aerobically you're very fit, then the bone will succumb to injuries. And we still see that. So these are the type of injuries that we've seen for centuries. 1855 was when march fractures were first diagnosed in Prussian soldiers, and we still see them today. And some of these injuries are very difficult to mitigate, particularly when they happen early on in training. So you're right, women are more susceptible to injuries. And we see that women experience a greater risk of medical downgrading and leaving the military because of injuries in the trained strength as well.
So it sounds like the physiology, the genetics is causing problems, but what about the benefits? So if we're looking at the things that are unique to women, what are the benefits that they get from being different to men in a military environment?
That's a really great question because we focus on these issues which only become really apparent in a very male-designed organisation. You know, you might have read the paper by Dr. Friedel, whereas what if we had men operating in a defence designed by women, which, you know, might be a bit tongue-in-cheek, but really illustrates that if you're not considering your whole population, then you're not going to address the issues that are really kind of important from an inclusivity perspective. But there are positives. Women have a metabolic advantage. Women oxidize fat more readily during submaximal exercise than men. And so the type of exercise that's characteristic of long patrols, these are not high intensity exercises, but they're prolonged. It's a long time on foot, but they are submaximal. And women benefit under those conditions because they're able to preserve their muscle on preserved field exercise. We've measured this. Women preserve muscle, men start to break down their muscle on field exercise. So there's a metabolic benefit of women when they're operating in those environments. And this is under conditions where both men and women are in energy deficit. But again, because women are smaller, they don't burn as many calories as men, and therefore they don't experience the severe energy deficit that men do. So there are advantages that I think haven't paid dividends yet. I think the more that we have women operating in these environments, we'll start to really see those benefits. But I really want to circle back round to having systems designed for men, because training, nutrition, all these policies have been obviously based on the male phenotype and the requirements for men, but they are different for women. And so if we train more properly for women's needs and where their weaknesses are, and we can feed them based on their own physiology, I think we're going to see a population who are going to have huge value, because we can reduce that risk of injury, we can start improving our policies and just making sure that all of our populations are getting the training and nutritional requirements they need.
There's a phrase that I heard a few years ago, and it was shrink it and pink it. Now, that sounds like not a very effective way of dealing with women in these sorts of roles. It sounds way more complicated than simply slightly lighter weights or slightly smaller machinery that they have to carry. It's not just a case of making things smaller, is it?
No, it's not. It's very nuanced. Women become quite a complicated research model because of hormone fluctuations, having to control for the menstrual cycle. And I think some of it's just easier just to research men. In our environment, though, most of the population are men. 90% of military are men. And I think that representation for women, 10% of the army is about 11.5, I think, for RAF or a bit higher. It's probably even increased over time. And so when you have such a male-dominated environment and, you're preparing your people to win wars on land and the majority of them are men, you could probably see why there's been that kind of creep that everything's been based on men. But we are learning a lot more about women, generally, a lot more about women in the sporting world. Doesn't mean that we can use those data and assume that they're applicable in the military. We have very unique operational stresses, and we need to be using frameworks and tools that are really specifically developed on evidence that we have from our female soldiers and relevant to the stresses that they're exposed to. And those stresses are typically prolonged energy deficit, lack of sleep, psychological stress, of which they converge and have a conflating effect. So it's really important that we start to understand, how do women operate in these extreme environments? And that's not even considering the extreme cold, extreme heat, altitude. That's just purely your regular operations and field exercises. I think it's going to take a lot more to get there, but we're really starting to understand how we can start improving policies now, and that's what we are doing. But also we're unpacking where some of those deficits have been for men. So this is not just about women. How can we improve the situation for both men and women?
Julie, from a training perspective, obviously both men and women have similar adaptive potential. If we provide the training stimulus and we balance everything out, we would expect to see some form of positive adaptation. However, you often hear individuals stating it, the menstrual cycle will impact upon how women can adapt to a given training stimulus. So what is the current state of play in this area? Is that correct, or is it a myth?
That's a really topical and a really important question. And just to bounce back with the initial comment that you have, we know, and we've got a huge amount of data, that women gain the same percentage or relative gains in strength and aerobic fitness than men in basic training. We publish systematic reviews on this, and we see it with even controlled studies. Of course, women have a lower baseline, so that will never change. But there is overlap between men and women. If we look at the sex differences initially, there is overlap. That overlap is much greater for aerobic performance than for strength. So that gives an indication of where some of our training priorities need to really focus. But if we look at strength, and this is becoming quite popularised, I think, with some of the elite sporting teams, is about training around the menstrual cycle. And in fact, I think it might be worthwhile for the audience who are unfamiliar with the hormonal rhythm of the menstrual cycle, if I may, I'll just give a brief kind of overview.
Please do.
I'm going to make it clear that this is a healthy cycle, and I'll explain why I've emphasised that in a moment. But a healthy cycle is between 24 and 35 days. And this is a tightly regulated biological rhythm. If it's shorter or longer, something has gone wrong. And the cycle results in a 12-month period with around sort of 9 ovulatory events. So women don't ovulate every cycle, we know that, but 9 of 12 are ovulatory. And the two main features, and I'm going to really break this down really simply, I'm not going to go into detail, but the menstrual cycle phase is largely characterized by the follicular phase, and it starts with menstrual bleeding, and then estrogen levels start to increase across the follicular phase as the eggs start developing in the ovary, and this leads to ovulation mid-cycle. And this is where estrogen levels start to peak, and estrogen levels have to be at a certain level before ovulation is elicited. And then the menstrual cycle then transitions into the luteal phase, that post-ovulation phase. But this is where progesterone levels are highest, and progesterone is produced by the empty sac of the egg, and that dominates. The purpose of the whole cycle is to develop an egg. The egg is obviously released, ready for fertilization, and then the endometrial lining is prepared by progesterone for implantation. That's the architecture and the main events of the cycle. So we have these hormonal fluctuations across the cycle. The first half dominated by estrogen. I'm only talking about the sex steroid hormones. And the second half dominated by progesterone. There is a slight increase in testosterone just prior to ovulation. And I think between these very high estrogen concentrations and testosterone, the belief is that those two hormones will exert an anabolic effect on muscle. And there'll be greater gains in strength with training if that training is really focused on the first phase of the menstrual cycle. There's a couple of points I really want to make here is that, firstly, there is no evidence of an effect. There's been systematic reviews published that we really see no effect of the menstrual cycle on physical performance with a healthy cycle. There's also been some great work done with a Canadian group that have shown that muscle protein synthesis does not differ across the menstrual cycle. So these hormones are not having an anabolic effect on muscle. I think the second important point is it's difficult for any woman to know which part of the cycle she's in. Ovulation can change. Even within the same woman, the day of ovulation will change. So she never knows when she's going to ovulate. So she could totally and utterly misread when her peak of estrogen levels actually are. And this is really important in our population because volume is everything. Women are not going to get strong by accident, and training volume is really critical, particularly strength. If women compromise on strength, particularly periodized strength training, then they're not going to get the optimal gains in performance that we need to be able to meet their standards and to protect themselves against injury. So it's really impractical to even train around the menstrual cycle, and women will compromise their quality of training if they attempt that. And also what's normal for service women, because what we've shown is that we have a high prevalence of menstrual disturbances in our population. We have high incidences of anovulation, so that women might be bleeding, but they're not ovulating, particularly with arduous training. They suffer luteal phase deficiency, so that second half of the cycle is shortened, but normally that's offset by a longer follicular phase. Or they suffer amenorrhea. A quarter of our women have a history of amenorrhea, which means that for at least 3 consecutive cycles, they haven't had a period. And what that basically means for our women is that they're not getting the estrogen exposure that's really important for their musculoskeletal health. So it is something that we really need to tackle. So I think when we pool those 3 key points, we really don't want women to train around the menstrual cycle. And also, it's military. They haven't got the control that athletes will have, and they have to operate at any time of the cycle. They need to be strong at any time of the cycle. So they're the 3 key reasons. The first one is probably the most important, which is no evidence of an effect anyway. So yeah, not practical. It's not science-backed. And we have a bigger issue with trying to normalise the cycle.
On the cycle and the follicular and luteal phases, some of the work I've done around sleep, you see differences in core body temperature across those different phases, which means that some women who menstruate will have trouble with sleep. I mean, do you see any other side effects across those different phases in terms of injury risk profile? I remember reading years ago about joint laxity at different phases of the menstrual cycle. Is that true? Is there any risk associated with training at different points?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because with athletes, I think the epidemiology data suggests that training around mid-cycle, when estrogen levels are highest, can be injurious to the sinew tissues, which is like the ligaments and tendons. Mm-hmm. I mean, you think about bone, muscle and sinew tissues, they're all very different tissues, which will probably be affected by hormones in different ways. And it's not just about the menstrual cycle. 60% of our women take contraceptives. So women are either have menstrual irregularities or disturbances, or they take in some form of hormonal contraceptives. And they do that, obviously, to prevent pregnancy. pregnancy, which is important. But they also take it to control their bleeding, because bleeding in the field and on operations is the one thing that women don't want to have on their mind. So I think there's two issues there. We are analysing our data at the moment because we've looked at muscle performance and various other things in bone health relevant to the injuries that our women sustain. We've looked across the cycle at regular time points, and we've compared it to the contraceptives that are popular with our women, because we need our women to make informed decisions about whether to take contraceptives or not, and also to understand whether at some points of their cycle their tissues might become a little bit more susceptible to injury. But we need our women to train at any time of the cycle. So we also need to be really pragmatic, I think, with what informed decisions we are providing our women, because there are times when that's really out of their control. But I think what is really important on this topic is that if women want to stop their periods, or they don't want to bleed, or they feel much better on a contraceptive, or the anxiety is mitigated, if they can control that, then they need to make that decision. It doesn't have to be long term. If they go on an OPS, they don't have to be on the Depo-Provera, which is the injected contraceptive, for the next 10 years, because that's damaging to bone. It might be okay in the short term. So women can start making really tactical decisions around their menstrual cycle, where they come off the contraceptives, because we all know that hormonal contraceptives downregulates the whole reproductive axis and stops natural estrogen being produced, stops ovulation. And there will be times where it will be good for women to give them estrogen exposure, to give the tissues what it needs to remain robust.
Julie, a couple of years ago, your team came out with a really nice review paper looking at REDS, Relative Energy Deficiency Syndrome, in military, and talking about the issues with the lack of energy availability and the concept of the female athlete triad. Could you give our listeners an insight into that concept and how within the military environment the impact can be more pronounced and what drives that?
That's a really cheeky question, but it's a great one, because it's complicated. I should have seen that come in. I really should have done. But it is a really important question, because REDS is a really important issue for athletes, and it's really brought conversations to the table which are protecting women and highlighting and educating athletes. We've got a more complicated environment, and my concern with adapting the REDS framework, which in the literature now is called RED-M, Relative Energy Deficiency in the Military, to our service women, I think we need to be really cautious. We know that in the military, all of our service personnel, men and women, will be exposed to energy deficiency. And sometimes that could be really quite severe. Out in the field for days on end, women will be expending around 3,500 kilocalories a day. Men will be exceeding probably 5,000 kilocalories a day. That's a huge amount of energy to replenish out in the field, and it doesn't happen. So energy deficits can be really severe. But what we tend to see is that energy deficiency is because of logistical problems. Even though the ration packs are designed to provide about 4,400 kilocalories a day, they can often be stripped out. So it's more about many fatigue, satiety, as opposed to purposeful energy restriction, because when we looked at this in phase 1 environments back in camp, it's almost like super compensation. They'll come back and eat really well, and we'll probably even get the takeaway pizzas and stuff, So we are not seeing that kind of same behaviour. It's more of an episodic yo-yoing of energy deficiency. And in fact, we've seen with our very prolonged arduous training courses that women, even though we know that men and women will suffer severe energy deficits in the field, they actually put on more fat mass over the course of their longer courses. So I think the high prevalence that we see in our menstrual disturbances in our women, and we see drops in testosterone too in men, we've seen it at Brecon. And when we refed at Brecon, we didn't see any rescue or recovery in testosterone. We did in performance, but what is quite common, I think, throughout the whole of these long courses, arduous courses, particularly obviously the infantry, is that they lack sleep. My biggest concern right now is the impact of sleep, whether it's deprivation, restriction. We don't know how the different architectures of sleep might be affected, but the reproductive axis is being hammered, and we need to be better at our sleep hygiene in the military. Understand there will be times when they have to be sleep deprived, and that's fine, but how we look after our people before they go into the field and afterwards, I think, needs to become the focus. But for women, that could be detrimental, because they will potentially suffer menstrual disturbances, which will increase their ill health.
Yeah, women and sleep is under-researched. So I think you're definitely onto something there. We know when men are sleep restricted and sleep deprived, we know a lot about what happens to them. But just generally speaking, the amount of research on women is pretty small, to the point where when I was studying sleep medicine, we did a whole module on special populations, and 90% of that was about women's sleep. They're just considered a specialist population because there's so little research. We just don't know really what happens to things like the menstrual cycle, or whether cognitive performance is selectively degraded in women more than it is in men. We just don't know. So the research needs to be done for sure.
Well, we've looked at this with the commissioning course, where women and men obviously undertake the 44-week course, and it's arduous for most of that time. And we've shown that most women stop ovulating by the intermediate term. But, there's lots of things going on, so you can't really unpack those kind of stresses. So we took that research into more of a survey-based approach across the 3 services, and we showed high prevalences of menstrual disturbances. But the key risk factor was sleeping less than 6 hours compared with sleeping over 8 hours a night. So was MSKI. So when we look at injuries, sleep came out as a key risk factor for MSKI. And so there's a common thread in the whole of our research programme, which was huge. And we didn't have a whole work programme on sleep, but we looked at those risk factors, and it just keeps coming up, whether it's menstrual disturbances, MSKI, upper respiratory tract infection. It's there, and we need to do something about that.
If we maybe pivot away from physically arduous training for a moment and consider sort of psychologically arduous things like high stress workplaces, or maybe people who've got relatively sedentary roles, but they're psychologically demanding. Has any of your research looked at the psychological differences between women and men, or any of the things we've already talked about, like the menstrual cycle, that can potentially support striving and thriving under stress, or can potentially thwart the ability to deal with those difficult situations?
So we didn't really specifically look at cognitive performance as an outcome measure. We looked at psychological health, because we know in our women, compared with men, that they are more prone to psychological ill health. And we got some really fascinating data, again, from Sandhurst, where we infused with synecthin at 4 different time points of the course. And we also measured hair cortisol, which we know obviously is an indicator of stress for that preceding 3 months. And there were sex differences, there was sexual dimorphism in the response, the cortisol response to that training. We showed that with women, they came in stressed. They were stressed 3 months before they came in, and their cortisol levels remained high for the whole of the 44 weeks. Men had more of a dynamic response. It was low and then it would peak, and there was that kind of pattern throughout the whole course. So we know that there are sex differences in the cortisol response. What fascinates me, and I think we need to really look at this in greater detail, there's also sex differences in the gut-brain axis, which in part could really drive some of these sex differences in neuropsychiatric disorders. And we need to better understand that in the military, which I talk to my team all the time about the microbiome. I think they're accepting that we'll be measuring stool samples, because we really need to understand it, because it plays a really pivotal role as well with sex hormones. The gut microbiome helps metabolize estrogen, and vice versa. The sex hormones really also modulate gut microbiomes. So there's a bidirectional relationship we need to better understand. And so I think that might really start to help us elucidate some of these susceptibilities to anxiety and depression. And we see, and we've measured this with clinically validated questionnaires, that women have a high incidence of common mental health disorders. So anxiety, depression, 25%, eating disorders, 13%. So I suspect that we're going to start to really drill down into that in more detail, because it's something that we've identified. We need to do something about that. So I think from a psychological health, we're starting to unpack what that looks like. But we don't know what effect sleep deprivation or restriction has on that either. So we work in this really complex multi-stressor environment, and unpicking those stresses and looking at their individual effects is really quite difficult.
Do you think there would be scope to utilise the allostatic load model to look at this from a multifactorial perspective, and to consider all these stressors and their potential negative impacts on both male and female, and see if there's a delineation that way?
I do, and that's the way some of our colleagues are going anyways, is to look at allostatic load. I think what's really kind of important in these environments is, and this has been shown in the female athlete triad kind of environment, it is the synergistic effect of all of these stresses. And I talk in context of the menstrual cycle and bone health, that they have an additive effect. There's separate effects, but there's also an additive effect. What's really important in terms of looking in allostatic loads is, well, what do we do about that? How are we going to change how we train, or how are we going to protect the health of our people when it's such a complex kind of stressful environment? Because having now lived the whole implementing research findings and having such a complex environment, it can be really difficult to drive through some of these actions through to change to the benefit of our soldiers. So I think there's more we need to learn there.
Julie, if we can pivot away to an example or a scenario and see what you think. So imagine one of our listeners is considering entering an area of defence or security, or they're going to do something arduous. Maybe it's even an ultra marathon or something like that. If they've listened to you so far and they're thinking, okay, I need to change my training, like, where do they start? Like, what's the low-hanging fruit initially, and what are the main things that you think people need to know from the work you've done?
So just to kind of unpack that, we would look at physical training. We recommend a targeted physical training program, multimodal, and load carriage performance, for example, which is probably a bigger challenge for women because of kit and relatively heavier load. It requires upper and lower body resistance training. It requires good aerobic performance, and it requires specific load carriage training. So we need to look at all those elements. It's almost like training to be a heptathlete in a way. You have to be looking at all those different components. And I think it's very difficult in such an operationally busy environment to be consistent and get the volume of training in to really, I think, benefit from those training principles. I think is really difficult. I said before that men can get away sometimes with their strength because they're generally stronger and can meet their standards. Women have to train to meet those standards and to maintain them. Then is the nutrition, and we can really unpack this because we've done some studies which have been the first in protein, for example, which is what's the protein requirements for women? We get them strength training, but how do we put the icing on the cake to really enhance their muscle protein synthesis? And we've shown in a controlled environment with multi-day whole body resistance training, as opposed to using single-legged exercise, that women need 30 grams of protein, similarly to men, and there is no difference there. So educating women on what that protein looks like, good sources of protein, not to rely on supplements, but there's lots of ways to get protein from the diet and distribute that throughout the day. What does 30 grams look like for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner? I think we can really start getting some really good performance edge. But then what we do have is a high prevalence of micronutrient deficiencies. Iron in particular, we know that menstruating women are more susceptible to iron deficiency because obviously they lose their iron through blood. We can't make it in the body. We have to have that through the diet. And we've shown that in a large scale study that's associated with decreased aerobic performance, increased musculoskeletal injury risk, and impaired bone health, which we showed for the first time, which was quite alarming. So we need to supplement women with iron. And it gets worse with arduous courses because of the inflammation of the course. Iron status really does deteriorate in men and women, but has a bigger impact for women. Calcium is really important as well. So again, these micronutrients in the diet is important. And we know that the lower limbs, for example, they adapt really well to military training. In fact, military training is really osteogenic for bone. But if calcium intake through the diet is insufficient, then calcium will be taken from sites that are less relevant, such as the spine, and redistributed to the lower limb. So we see what we believe is a redistribution of calcium if it's insufficient in the diet. So should we be supplementing with calcium is something that we looked at in the lab. And we know if we give 1,000 mg of calcium, it offsets those detrimental effects in terms of bone biochemistry, and is one of our recommendations. So we're really starting to drill down here about how can we give our women the performance edge, health edge, that obviously would benefit men too, but these are really specific to women where their kind of susceptibilities are. And then menstrual health is really pivotal. And I would put that in my kind of triad of training, nutrition and menstrual health, because we need women to have that estrogen exposure. And if something goes wrong with the menstrual cycle, I call it the fifth vital sign for health. I don't think I coined that. I probably read it somewhere, but I think it's superb, because if something goes wrong with the menstrual cycle, something is gone wrong in the body, something's out of balance, out of kilter. So we need women to track their menstrual cycle, and they need to be really in tune of what their normal looks like, so that when they go into the field or on operations and is not normal, they know what that looks like too. So if women start these arduous courses and develop amenorrhea and they know what their cycle should look like, then at least they can go, right, this is the flag. I can go to my doctor and go, it's changed, something's gone wrong. Or they could even self-reflect and think, right, I've been sleep deprived, I've been in energy deficit, I've had a bit of a rough ride over the last month and a half. I now need to really start correcting these when I'm able to, so women can be empowered to start really looking after their menstrual health. And we've just done this brilliant piece of work over the last few years. It's called Empower, which is an acronym to basically empower women to monitor their menstrual cycle, but using wearables to detect ovulation. Because if women can pick up that signature of ovulation with their wearables, that will give them the tools to be able to really track themselves as well. Because women don't go to their doctor to seek help if they're not ovulating, because they don't know they are or not. So they would be my top three to really get women to perform to their very best in these very difficult environments. And obviously sleep is really pivotal. So there are times when our people can't sleep because it's operationally imperative, but sort out the sleep hygiene when they can. And it's all in that preparation and recovery space, I think.
That makes a lot of sense. That's really good advice. If people want more information on that sort of stuff that you've just talked about, is that information available online that we can maybe get into the show notes? Is there reports or easily digestible information that people can read in their own time?
I feel like I've always set you up to say that, because we have written an arduous training guide for women, and that will be in their hands very shortly. As soon as it's available, we'll provide that. And it's all taken from all of our published work, so it's all taken from peer-reviewed articles.
That's awesome. So if you were to look into the future then and kind of look at all the work you've done, all the awesome research you've conducted and the action points that you've mentioned, what do you feel needs to change for this all to be implemented? Is there anything that you'd like to see happen over the next 5-10 years in order to just allow this research to be used and allow these action points that you've discussed to get out to the people that need them?
Well, I think we've really been pathfinding with the delivery of this research, which was no mean feat, I must be honest. But we've done it, and I think now implementing research successfully and setting up what our framework looks like to implement will be pivotal. I talk to a lot of Army units now and deliver a lot of webinars. And there's passion and enthusiasm for this knowledge. So 10 years ago, when I used to have even discussions in a room about periods, nobody wanted to know. Now the organisation wants that conversation. And that's really positive. I've seen this seismic change in that kind of culture from my experience over the last 10 years, and it's been absolutely incredible. But now everybody understands that human performance really is so critical for our people as a capability, and to know that those data also exist for women, I think is phenomenal, and everybody really wants to have the knowledge in their hands. You know, it's commanders, seniors. I'm experiencing this, I think, at all levels of leadership, where leaders want to have the knowledge, and I just think that's probably been the most rewarding thing I think I've experienced out of the whole of this research.
Julie, so what's next then from an applied research perspective? Do you see these initiatives sort of rolling out real world, and what sort of changes would you hope to see translating all the great work which you guys have done in regards to the research to the guys and girls on the ground, boots on the ground, so to speak?
So I think from our point of view, we really want to focus on our really high performance space, because we haven't researched women in GCT roles. They came in 2019 and we were well in the throes of researching our legacy force. So we need to understand a lot more about high performance for women and start looking at those extreme cold environments and in the heat. I'm really encouraged by the data from our US colleagues, where they showed that female graduates of the Ranger course, the differences between men and women are really diminished in terms of psychological and physical when women really start having the opportunity of training optimally, and to probably obviously have that drive to do so, that grit and perseverance, then we really see that those sex differences kind of close. So I think women have got a lot more to give if we create that environment to do so. So we want to support that. We want to bring women into the lab and provide them that kind of physiological support and make it more kind of equitous, because there is a mystery around training and we need to demystify that. I think education is really key. I think we still have lots and lots to exploit. And I think it is all about educating. But I think we need to make sure that we're educating the right people in the right way, and also a clinical framework for service women. And we now have a NATO panel that I chair, a research task group, to develop almost the equivalent of what we have for the Red S, the clinical kind of assessment tool. We need that for the military, where we will have framework for what happens if you have poor sleep or psychological stress or energy deficiency, and how can we recognise those at high risk so we can intervene early. So that's the kind of the next steps for us. In addition to all the other research that we do, obviously just mainstream, is that we've got some really exciting projects in the pipeline.
That's great, and lots of microbiome stuff. So anyone applying for a job at the Army needs to bring their own gloves. Is that the main thing? Julie, thank you very much for the conversation. It's been fascinating, and a genuine world-leading expert in this area. So it's a real privilege to talk to you about this kind of stuff. To close out the episode, we invite you to tell us something you haven't told us yet that you still think is very important, or maybe to reinforce a message that you've already told us, to hammer that nail into the coffin. So Julie, again, thank you from me. That's a huge privilege. But over to you. How would you like to close the episode up for us?
So for all the women out there who really want to try these arduous roles, you can get the training right, get the nutrition right, get your sleep right, and really track your menstrual health. And you're on that journey, I think, to thrive in a military environment. And we will have those tools more readily available for you, I think, in the very near future. So give it a go. It's achievable.
A great message to end with.
Awesome.
If people want to learn about your research and maybe get access to those tools as they come out, what's the best way of them reaching out to you and maybe connecting?
Well, there's two different ways. All our work is in the published domain. If you really want to delve down into the science, so you can just search my name on the academic engines. And otherwise, I'm really happy for people to contact me directly. I am on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out. I'm here to help.
Great stuff. We'll get your LinkedIn profile on the show notes. Julie, wonderful conversation. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you soon.
Our pleasure. Thanks, both. Thank you.
Thanks. Cheers, bud.
That's it for this week's episode of the Optimising Human Performance podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and if you found this valuable, take a moment to rate and review the podcast. If you know someone who'd benefit from today's conversation, then please share this with them. We're always keen to hear your thoughts. If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or topics that you'd love us to cover, then email us at info@ophp.co.uk or connect with us on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep striving, keep improving, and keep optimizing your performance.